So firstly, thank you so much, and wonderful to see the names of some of the great people participating here. I think we'll all agree that there's a lot to do. This is a really difficult situation. I don't think any of us have experienced this ever in our lifetime. And in keeping with that, I am not going to spend much time introducing what I have to say. I'm going to get down to it straight away. I'm touching on these 5 aspects where there is going to be an impact. And in the end, of course, I'm going to say what is common sense, very well known. I'm just trying to put it all together in one place. So what is going to change is who are we teaching? After the pandemic, it's not the same group of children who are coming back to us. Things are changing. How will we teach them? We cannot continue with the same old method and the way that we have been using all along. What will we teach? This too is going to change. And who is going to teach? The person teaching them, even though is the same person as before, is now going to be very different. And the overall framework, the environment, the relationships within which this is going to happen is also going to change. And what are the implications of all of this for what we are doing? This is what I'm going to touch upon in the next 10 minutes or so. So all of you are already familiar that a lot of children are not going to come back to school. The economic realities are going to catch up. There is increasing domestic work, which will keep girls at home. We already see reports of child trafficking increasing, early marriage. Child labor, of course, is going up. Bonded labor is on the rise. For older children, the chances are that they are not going to be able to continue to study. So this itself presents a huge challenge before us, because over the last 2 decades, we've really worked a lot on the issue of retention, dropout, and now we are going to find that this is seriously challenged. Everybody's, of course, talking of the huge learning loss and learning disparities, the gap between those who were doing relatively well and those who were doing relatively poor. That gap is going to go on increasing in a dramatic way. However, I just want to mention that this learning loss might be secondary to other issues, in particular those related to the socio-emotional dimension of children's lives at the present moment. So yes, this is important, but only in keeping with everything else. If you look at classes 1 and 2, they've completely missed school. They never got to attend school at all, and they'll now be joining perhaps in class 3. And those who are in class 3 to 5, they missed half of their entire primary school. And this is happening at an age when children's development is very, very accelerated. Till about the age of 8, children develop so fast. Now, when they come back at the age of 9 or 10, and you want to do everything that was done earlier, it may not take exactly as less time as you think it will. It might be more complicated. There are studies to show that when children are taught things which they should have learned earlier, if not handled in a particular way, they end up taking a lot more time than you imagine. So this whole idea of catching up itself has to be nuanced, especially for those in primary levels. Many children are, of course, going to be physically weaker. They would have eaten less. Many of them would have been less mobile. Both these things put together, and illness and deprivation. And of course, all of us are aware of how the data is very limited in terms of children who are facing deaths in their families. If you start looking at it in greater detail, you find that students have been through enormous amounts of emotional trauma, physical trauma, of course. They've also missed the social function of school. It's something we don't often emphasize, but is the fact that you're with others and that you can physically connect. That's what they've been missing. So what's going to happen is that with private schools closing down, even though children are dropping out, it is very possible, and already there are indications in, for example, Andhra, that more children are now coming into government schools, but they are a more diverse group than ever before. And many migrating families which kind of return, they're not taking children back to the cities with them. So you have Delhi schools which are relatively empty, but smaller schools in villages which are relatively more full. But they also have students from all over the country. It's not as if they're only diverse from within their own area. So the nature of the student group has become very diverse. It's not as if everything is only negative. The children have shown enormous amounts of resilience. They've learned a great deal. There are so many stories in the media that you see about what children are doing as well. And they've really taken to using technology wherever they can access it. They're making videos, for example. They've learned how to game the system as well, which is a great strength in a way if you use it well. So overall, when the pandemic is over, who we teach is not going to be the same. While we will need to make sure that there is less dropout than there is going to be bringing in out of school children, we also need to make it more purposeful for children to be there, because the pressure on them to be out of school is also going to be strong. The NEP 2020 definitely helps us by focusing on marginalized groups who are going to need more of inputs and support from us. The second area of how we are going to teach, this too, in any case, was expected to change with experiential learning coming in. But from being teacher dependent, we are not talking of a situation where children are less teacher dependent. They already have got used to it, but maybe they're more device dependent. You learn mainly from two-dimensional space, which is what was on paper or on screen. Yeah, can somebody please put on the mic? Okay, so you now children have got used to being alone, learning with a screen wherever they have, of course, and some have been fortunate not to be in this situation. Some have been left entirely to their own devices. They might have developed totally different habits of being alone with a screen, using mobile phones, doing the kind of things which earlier used to be treated as punishable offenses. So how are they going to now adjust? And of course, they are learning from multiple sources, not just the textbook. So greater engagement. All along, school was always a very competitive sort of space, who's doing better than others. But now it will be compelled to, because the only way we can survive a situation like the pandemic is by being supportive of each other. And this is something which is likely to continue, as experts tell us. So the future is in learning collaboration rather than competition. And again, the social function of school, which we earlier took for granted, now it has to be implemented more deliberately and become part of the teaching learning process. The teachers will also need to partner with family and community, not just to make sure there are health and hygiene supplies, but also to enable learning to happen, because learning itself is changing. It's going to become more dynamic, more flexible. Earlier, we were doing a relatively one-size-fits-all approach. Now, how do we make diversity happen? We had multilingual, multi-grade situations, but now inside the grade itself, the diversity is going to become very huge. So from the usual routine of typically fixed periods, we now may have to move to a totally different way of working. And children who used to be quiet, if they do not speak, basically teaching is not happening anymore. Lastly, we've always given so much of emphasis on what can easily be assessed. But now we need to assess things like ability to empathize, collaborate, be rational in your approach, derive an inference, make connections. So even assessment and what we teach both are connected. They're going to change. The biggest pressure that I see is that earlier, the teacher had a captive audience. Once children were in class, they couldn't go anywhere. But with technology, they can just switch you off or just stop paying attention and you don't even know. And that is a trend that will continue into school as well. So you now have to captivate your audience, and that is the biggest pressure that I see. So yes, the shift from the cognitive to the social and the need to make sure that you actually engage is going to go up. And the NEP talks about experiential learning. What will we teach? This is something which I think everybody does talk about quite a bit, from absorption of content to learning skills, resourcefulness, 21st century skills, resilience. As I mentioned, we will need to move away from the exam focus, the scholastic subjects focus, to a more holistic focus for preparing children for life, for the kind of unknown potential disruptions that there are in socio-emotional learning being a very, very strong focus, which has been kind of ignored to a great extent. You might be aware that the NCERT, with support from mandate from Ministry of Education, has already initiated the process of developing state curriculum frameworks for various age groups, various kinds of learners in the states. So the new curriculum frameworks that will emerge will have to take all of these realities into account. And if at any point you are engaged with them, do emphasize these, keeping in mind that NEP 2 emphasizes higher order learning. Basics are not enough anymore. Just a quick word about the teachers. It's often forgotten that they've also been through trauma. Thousands and thousands of teachers have died or experienced death in their family or other kinds of issues. Interestingly, before the pandemic, it was very common in social media to keep hearing that government teachers are useless. But if you now look at any innovative approach to children, you will find that predominantly that is being done by government school teachers in different, they have responded, but often they have not been supported. And that's the thing that really needs to change. They have a challenge on their hand. They have to change their profession, their way of working, what they're teaching and how they're teaching, but they need a lot of support for that to happen. And for that, they have to be partners rather than employees who are just doing what they're told to do. And which is why they have to be part of the decision-making process of what they do in their class. It's not as if just giving them instructions or scripts is going to be enough. And this has implications of NGOs working with schools. I keep hearing messages from a lot of teachers about how NGOs treat them. And I think that is an area that needs to change. This is more or less the second last slide. And the environment is the physical environment, the social environment, the organizational environment. And in the physical environment, which essentially was more to promote learning, I'm talking of this because there's a lot of investment in infrastructure. But the purpose of infrastructure is now also becoming in terms of ensuring health and hygiene. So that puts different kinds of pressure on us. It's not at all easy to spend that kind of money or do those kind of processes in our context. It's not designed for it. Another big change that I see happening is that in the last 2 years, how people have used their time has become very different. So when you, for example, attended an online class, you could do other things along with it, which you can't do in a physical class. That's what teachers could also do. The manner in which we use our time has become so different that one challenge is going to be that how will we now adjust to the rigor or regime of a typically fixed schedule, especially as we have seen, you need to be very flexible. So this is the challenge that I believe we will need to address. There is greater need for participation of the community, partnership with them, but at the same time, community and families are facing a lot of pressure because they have economic difficulties to face. And pre-pandemic, they were ignored. They didn't have a right to really intervene much in school, even though SMCs exist. And they too, on their part, kind of outsourced their children's learning. But now this cannot continue that way. The partnership has to become very different. So I'm sure all of you have a lot of experience in this regard, and those points will also come up. And lastly, I want to mention that there is an area of concern, which is that if I look at state systems, they're somehow so obsessed with trying to, approximate what used to be there earlier. And they've been trying to keep teachers busy, loading them with training programs, assignments, that in a way, I get the impression that they're not looking ahead at what is happening. The game has changed, but they're still playing the old game. And that is something which we will need to confront as we go along. So this has many implications, of which I have chosen 3 to mention here. As we begin working, this is an emergency situation. So yes, there will be many immediate efforts which have to be made, and they're being done in any case. But we also need to take a strong, long look at the future. It is an opportunity to make major changes, but it also is a necessity to make some of those changes. It will not do to continue with the pre-COVID kind of situation that we had. So one of the issues I often face with CSR programs is that they are very short term. 2 years seems to be the approximate longest period that I come across mostly. But if we can plan for 5 years, 6 years, even longer than that, then the chances are that we will be more successful. Another thing is to not plan in silos, but to see things more systemically and involve stakeholders from the beginning. It might be slower to begin, but it would be better to plan not just in terms of activities, but in terms of change to be brought about. So this requires an understanding of how do teachers change, how do schools change, how do systems change, how do they learn, and instead of just becoming reduced to implementing some limited activities, it would be better to see what the role could be in bringing about change, and that needs a lot of deliberation. So one suggestion would be to use the coming few weeks to actually discuss this to a great extent. And lastly, this is a common issue. Very often all programs are all about the inputs. There are norms for it, there are budgets for it, but what happens is when you implement them in reality, it doesn't go as per plan because things are very dynamic. However, if you fix the outcome, for example, if you fix that I will do 5 hours of teaching, some children will learn, but some will not learn. So your inputs are fixed. But if you fix that all children will learn at least this, then some will learn in 5 hours and some will learn in 3 hours with a different method and some in 6 hours with a different method. So how do you incorporate that flexibility so that you can stick to the outcomes is the challenge that the present situation faces. So this is what I would say are some of the major impacts of COVID on education ahead. Thank you all very much for your patience, and I'll be happy whenever the chance is to respond or talk more. Thank you.